The year everything changed began like any other, with the house waking before the sun and the familiar sound of someone boiling water in the kitchen while the rest of us lingered in that soft space between sleep and responsibility where nothing bad has ever happened yet. I remember lying in bed that morning, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling above me, thinking not about fear or loss or money, but about how strange it was that after all these years, this house still felt like the only place in the world where my body knew how to rest. I had come home temporarily, or at least that was how everyone framed it, including me, a pause between one version of my life and the next, a short stay before I moved on to the final stage of my studies, the part everyone liked to talk about because it sounded impressive when repeated to neighbors and distant relatives. There was pride in it, shared pride, the kind that made people say we instead of you, and I let myself believe that meant something solid and mutual rather than convenient. The house itself had not changed much over the years, though time had worn it down gently, rounding the corners instead of breaking them, and every mark on the walls had a story that someone was always ready to tell again. The hallway still smelled faintly of old wood and detergent, and the living room curtains let in light in thin, uneven lines that moved slowly across the floor as the day passed, marking time better than any clock. I knew the rhythm of the place intimately, the way mornings belonged to quiet efficiency and evenings softened into shared meals, arguments that never lasted long, and the background noise of a television no one was really watching. There were 5 of us living there then, though people came and went often enough that the number felt flexible, and at the center of everything was the youngest, the child everyone orbiting around seemed to move toward instinctively, whose laughter filled the house in a way that felt both new and reassuring, like proof that whatever else changed, joy had not left us. Preparations were already underway for an upcoming celebration, a milestone everyone spoke about with a kind of glowing anticipation that made even ordinary errands feel purposeful, and I joined in without hesitation, contributing ideas, money, time, because that was what I had always done, and because it felt good to be needed in ways that were so visible and uncomplicated. I had never questioned the way our family handled things like finances, because it had always worked on trust rather than structure, on the unspoken understanding that what belonged to one of us belonged to all, and that no one would ever take more than they needed without asking. When my final school fees came due, a sum that represented years of work, sacrifice, and careful planning, it felt natural to place that responsibility in the hands of someone older, someone who had always managed such things with calm authority. It was not a moment that felt significant enough to remember later, just a brief conversation in the kitchen, an envelope passed across the table, a reminder of the deadline spoken lightly, as if deadlines were suggestions rather than fixed lines. In those days, I was tired in a way that felt earned rather than ominous, the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying ambition carefully for a long time, balancing it with loyalty and gratitude, telling herself that there would be space later for rest and independence. I spent my afternoons revising notes, making lists, answering messages from administrators who used polite language that masked how little room there was for delay, and in the evenings I rejoined the household, slipping back into a role that felt automatic, helping with meals, listening to stories that looped and overlapped, offering advice when asked and silence when it was not. There was affection everywhere, the kind that showed itself in small gestures rather than declarations, an extra portion placed on my plate, a blanket pulled over my shoulders when I fell asleep on the couch, a casual mention of my name in conversations with outsiders that carried a note of pride. I noticed these things, collected them almost unconsciously, because they reassured me that whatever sacrifices I had made to get where I was had not pulled me too far away from the people who mattered. I believed, deeply and without reservation, that we were moving forward together, even if our paths looked different. As the celebration drew closer, the house grew louder and brighter, boxes arriving, plans shifting, budgets discussed in half-joking tones that suggested confidence rather than concern, and I watched it all with a quiet sense of satisfaction, feeling included in something communal and forward-looking. I contributed more than I probably should have, financially and emotionally, but it did not feel like overextension at the time, just participation, just love expressed in practical ways. When someone joked that I was the most reliable one among us, I laughed along, not hearing the weight that word would later carry. A few days before I was meant to leave town briefly for an academic obligation that could not be postponed, I packed my bag carefully, stacking my books by the desk, lining up my papers as if order itself might protect them, and I remember pausing, hand resting on the envelope that held my future in such a literal way, thinking not of risk, but of how strange it was that something so important could be reduced to paper and numbers. I reminded the family member holding onto it of the date once more, gently, and was met with a smile and a nod that carried no hint of anything other than reassurance. The goodbye that morning was unremarkable in the best way: hugs exchanged, reminders to eat properly and sleep enough, jokes about how quiet the house would feel without me, and I stepped out into the world carrying with me a sense of belonging that felt steady and earned. During my time away, I called often, not out of anxiety but habit, checking in on progress, laughing at updates about decorations and guest lists, feeling connected even at a distance, never once imagining that absence could change the meaning of trust so completely. When I returned, tired but satisfied, ready to settle back into the familiar rhythm before the next phase of my life began in earnest, the house greeted me with the same open door and familiar sounds, but something in the air felt subtly rearranged, as if furniture had been moved just enough to change the way a room carried sound. There were more packages stacked in corners, more voices overlapping at once, an energy that bordered on celebratory rather than merely anticipatory, and I stood there for a moment longer than usual, taking it all in, smiling to myself at how alive everything felt. At that point, nothing in me was guarded, nothing was braced for impact, because love, when it has been consistent for long enough, teaches you not to flinch at joy, and I had no reason yet to believe that this year, which had begun so gently, would end by forcing me to relearn every definition I thought I understood. I noticed the changes first in ways that were too small to name without sounding ungrateful, the kind of details you register quietly and then dismiss because families, like houses, are always shifting, always accumulating things that have to go somewhere. The hallway felt narrower with boxes stacked along one wall, and the living room carried a brightness that had nothing to do with sunlight, a polished, newly arranged kind of shine that suggested recent spending rather than careful saving, yet I told myself this was simply what celebration looked like from the outside, fuller and louder than preparation ever is. No one rushed to explain anything when I returned, which did not strike me as strange at first because conversations in our house had always unfolded organically, beginning with small talk and ending, eventually, wherever they needed to. I set my bag down, greeted everyone properly, accepted a drink I had not asked for, and sat among them listening as plans were discussed with an ease that suggested decisions had already been made and resolved. Names of vendors were mentioned, dates confirmed, arrangements laughed over, and I nodded along, absorbing it all with the comfortable sense of being included even when I was not speaking. It was only later, when the house settled into a quieter rhythm and I asked, almost absent-mindedly, about my school payment, that the room shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, as if a window had been opened somewhere and let in a draft no one wanted to acknowledge. The response came too quickly, wrapped in a tone meant to sound reassuring, explaining that the money had been used temporarily, that it was a practical decision made for the good of the family, and that of course everything would be sorted out soon, because it always was. At first, I genuinely did not understand what I was being told, not because the words were unclear, but because the meaning behind them did not fit into any category I had prepared for, and I found myself asking a second question, more specific, more careful, as if precision might return the conversation to familiar ground. That was when the details emerged, not all at once, but in fragments offered by different people, each piece slightly adjusted to suit the speaker, each justification leaning on a different version of reason, necessity, or shared responsibility. The money, I learned, had funded the celebration in ways that could no longer be undone, deposits paid, purchases made, commitments sealed with enthusiasm and confidence, all under the assumption that I would understand, that I would adapt, that my education could wait because it always had room to bend. No one said this directly, yet it was present in every explanation, in the casual way my concern was smoothed over, in the repeated assurance that I was capable, resourceful, and resilient, qualities that suddenly felt less like compliments and more like expectations pressed firmly into my hands. What unsettled me most was not the loss itself, though the numbers began arranging themselves in my mind with alarming clarity, but the way the decision had been framed as collective and obvious, as if any other choice would have been unthinkable. There had been no emergency, no sudden crisis that demanded immediate sacrifice, only a preference, shared and reinforced until it solidified into action, carried out during my absence with an ease that suggested my consent had been assumed rather than required. I listened, quietly, because raising my voice would have made the situation feel dramatic in a way it did not seem to deserve in their eyes, and because I was still trying to align the people in front of me with the ones I believed I knew. Each of them met my silence differently, some with nervous laughter, others with honest explanations that grew longer and more tangled the more they spoke, as if detail might substitute for accountability. No one apologized in a way that acknowledged harm, only inconvenience, and even that was treated lightly, like a scheduling conflict rather than a fundamental breach of trust. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me with how steady it sounded, asking practical questions about timelines and alternatives, trying to understand how they imagined this situation resolving itself without unraveling everything I had worked toward. The answers were vague, optimistic in the way only people insulated from consequences can afford to be, filled with suggestions rather than plans, confidence without commitment. It became clear, gradually and unmistakably, that the resolution they envisioned relied almost entirely on my willingness to absorb the impact quietly. There was a moment then, brief but sharp, when emotion rose in me unexpectedly, not anger, but a kind of dislocation, as if I had stepped slightly outside my own life and was observing it from a distance, noting how easily my priorities had been rearranged without my participation. I thought of the envelope changing hands in the kitchen weeks earlier, of the nod and smile that had seemed so ordinary at the time, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that trust is not broken loudly, but folded away, neatly and efficiently, until it no longer resembles itself. Instead of arguing, instead of listing sacrifices or demanding restitution, I said that I would delay my plans, that I would find a way to adjust, because it was clear that this was what everyone was waiting to hear. The relief in the room was immediate and collective, tension dissolving into gratitude expressed with casual warmth, reassurances offered that this was only temporary, that I would be supported, that everything would work out in the end. They thanked me for understanding, for being mature, for putting family first, and each word landed with a weight they did not seem to feel. That night, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed long after the house had gone quiet, replaying the conversation not for its content, but for its tone, for the ease with which my future had been negotiated in my absence. I did not cry then, though the emotion hovered close, because something else had begun to take shape in me, something colder and more deliberate than grief, an awareness that what had happened was not a mistake to be corrected, but a revelation to be understood. By the time I lay down, staring once more at the familiar ceiling, I had accepted that nothing would be returned to me in the way I had expected, not the money, not the certainty, not the version of belonging I had carried so confidently, and in that acceptance there was the beginning of a shift so quiet it did not yet feel like movement at all, only the sense that I would never again place anything essential to my future entirely in someone else's hands. In the days that followed, I remained exactly where everyone expected me to be, moving through the house with the same familiarity, contributing to conversations with the same measured warmth, occupying my place in the household as if nothing fundamental had been altered. Because disruption would have invited questions I was not yet prepared to answer, and because there was a strange clarity in observing a system from within once you no longer believed in its fairness. I learned quickly that when people think a matter has been resolved, they stop paying attention to its consequences, and my agreement to delay my plans had closed the discussion so completely that my presence faded back into the background, useful, dependable, unexamined. I adjusted my routine subtly, not in ways that announced themselves, but in ways that created small pockets of distance where there had once been automatic closeness, choosing to walk outside the house more often, letting evenings pass without filling every silence, redirecting my energy toward my own responsibilities rather than absorbing those of others. Where I had once anticipated needs before they were voiced, I now waited to be asked, and where I had once stepped in to smooth over minor inconveniences, I allowed them to remain slightly rough, just enough to be felt without becoming dramatic. The financial shifts were the easiest to manage because they required the least explanation, consisting mostly of things not done rather than actions taken, subscriptions quietly cancelled, standing payments redirected, shared expenses returned to individual hands under the guise of practicality. No one noticed at first because the amounts were small and the habit of my contribution had made them invisible, and when questions did arise, they were framed as temporary misunderstandings rather than signs of change, easily brushed aside with assurances that everything would be sorted out soon. I began to cultivate a life beyond the family with a deliberate patience that surprised me, attending meetings, following up on conversations, rebuilding connections that had been allowed to loosen over time because I had assumed there was no urgency in maintaining them. I did not speak of conflict or betrayal, only of transition, of reassessment, of the need to move carefully toward the next stage of my life, and I found that people were more willing to help than I had expected, not out of charity, but out of respect for clarity and purpose. Within the house, the celebration continued to expand, taking up more space, more attention, more resources, and I watched the adults move around it with a mix of pride and strain, their conversations increasingly threaded with concern they tried to mask as fatigue. The youngest absorbed it all without question, enjoying the attention and the promises made so freely, unaware of the way those promises leaned on assumptions that no one had stopped to examine. I did not resent the child, because this was never about them, and because resentment would have blurred the lines I was working carefully to redraw. What I did feel, more and more clearly, was a shift in how I was seen, not as an equal participant in the family's future, but as a stabilizing force they expected to remain constant regardless of circumstance. Requests came wrapped in familiarity rather than entitlement, framed as shared responsibility rather than obligation, yet each one carried the same underlying belief that I would adjust, that I always had. I responded with politeness and limits, agreeing when it made sense, declining when it did not, offering alternatives that required others to step forward rather than leaning automatically on me. There were moments of friction, brief and easily smoothed over, when someone noticed my absence in a role I had long filled, a bill unpaid, an errand delayed, a problem left unresolved longer than usual. These moments passed quickly, absorbed into the general busyness of the household, but they accumulated quietly, creating a background hum of inconvenience that had not existed before. I observed it without satisfaction or guilt, because what I was withdrawing was not generosity, but excess, the part of myself I had given freely without recognizing how thoroughly they had been absorbed into expectation. Outside the family, my plans began to take shape with a solidity that felt almost unreal after so much uncertainty, confirmations arriving, timelines firming up, possibilities narrowing into decisions that required commitment rather than hope. I kept this to myself, not out of secrecy, but out of a growing understanding that information is a form of access, and access, once granted, can be used in ways you do not control. The more certain my future became, the more careful I was about how much of it I allowed to exist within the walls of that house. One evening, after a long day, I sat alone in the living room while the rest of the family was out, the television silent, the decorations half finished around me, and I allowed myself, for the first time, to look directly at the question I had been avoiding, not what they had taken from me, but what they believed they were entitled to take. The answer settled slowly and unmistakably, not tied to a single decision or moment, but woven through years of small assumptions, of gratitude leveraged into obligation, of care offered with an unspoken expectation of return. By the time the front door opened and the house filled again with familiar sounds, I had reached a conclusion that did not feel like anger or resolve, but something quieter and more durable, an understanding that whatever came next would not be about confrontation or correction, but about repositioning myself so completely that the ground they stood on would shift without a single dramatic step being taken. The strain did not arrive all at once, because collapse rarely announces itself with ceremony, but seeped in through ordinary inconveniences that began to overlap in ways no one could quite trace back to a single cause. A payment was missed and explained away as a clerical delay, a promise had to be revised because a vendor suddenly became inflexible, a favor once taken for granted now required negotiation, and each small disruption was treated as temporary, as if the household were merely passing through a narrow stretch rather than drifting off course. I watched these moments accumulate with an attentiveness that felt new, not because I wanted to see anyone struggle, but because I was no longer cushioning the impact, no longer stepping forward to restore balance before imbalance could be noticed. What unsettled the family most was not the difficulty itself, but the absence of an obvious reason for it, because nothing dramatic had changed on the surface, no argument, no departure, no refusal that could be pointed to and labeled as the source of tension. I was still there, still participating, still polite and present, yet something essential had shifted, and they sensed it without being able to name it, which made their frustration diffuse and unfocused. Conversations grew sharper around the edges, patience wore thin more quickly, and decisions that had once been made with confidence were now delayed, revisited, questioned, as if the collective instinct that had guided them so easily before had begun to falter. They turned to me more often as the weeks passed, not with demands, but with that familiar tone of expectation that assumed my involvement before asking for it, bringing problems to me halfway solved, waiting for me to supply the missing piece. Each time, I listened carefully, asked questions that clarified responsibility rather than absorbing it, and offered responses that were measured and finite, help with limits rather than rescue. The surprise this caused was subtle but persistent, a flicker of confusion in expressions that quickly rearranged themselves into smiles, reassurances that everything was under control, that they only wanted my opinion, not my intervention. The celebration itself, now fully underway, began to show the cost of its scale in ways that could no longer be hidden behind enthusiasm, adjustments made quietly, expectations tempered without explanation, conversations lowering in volume whenever finances came up. The child remained insulated from this shift, protected by the adult's determination to preserve the image of abundance they had created, and I found myself observing this protection with a complicated mix of tenderness and distance, aware that the same instinct to shield had never extended to my future with quite the same urgency. It was during one of these strained evenings, when frustration had softened into fatigue and defenses were lowered by the simple need to be understood, that the truth surfaced, not as a confession, but as an offhand remark delivered without malice, spoken by someone who believed they were offering perspective rather than revealing anything significant. They spoke of my education as an investment, not in the abstract sense of hope or pride, but in terms that suggested expectation, return, alignment, as if my progress had always been measured against its usefulness to the family rather than its meaning to me. The words landed quietly, without the sharpness of accusation, and perhaps because of that, they cut deeper than anything said before, rearranging memories with an efficiency that left little room for doubt. Moments I had interpreted as support shifted into focus, revealing patterns I had overlooked, encouragement paired with conditions I had absorbed without recognizing them as such, sacrifices celebrated publicly but tracked privately. I understood then that the decision to use my school fees had not been a deviation from our values, but an expression of them, logical within a framework I had never fully questioned. I did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue against, no misunderstanding to correct, and because reacting would have suggested that this revelation required validation from the very people it implicated. Instead, I let the conversation move on, watched the relief settle back into the room as if something difficult had been said and resolved, and excused myself with a calm that felt almost ceremonial, marking the end of something I had carried longer than I realized. That night, I packed with intention rather than urgency, sorting through belongings not by necessity but by meaning, deciding what would follow me forward and what would remain behind as part of a life that no longer fit. I finalized arrangements that had been forming quietly for weeks, confirming timelines, securing commitments, aligning details with a precision that felt grounding rather than frantic. There was no sense of escape in it, no dramatic break, only the steady completion of a process that had been unfolding the moment I chose not to repair what was never meant to hold. When I told them I would be leaving, permanently this time, the reaction was immediate and uneven, surprise giving way to concern sharpening into accusation, questions tumbling over one another in an effort to regain footing. They asked what had changed, why now, how they were supposed to manage, and in those questions lay the clearest confirmation of everything I had come to understand, because not one of them asked what I needed, only what my absence would cause them. I answered simply, without elaboration or defense, explaining that my path required distance, that the delay they had asked of me had clarified rather than postponed my direction, that staying would mean continuing a role I no longer consented to play. The disappointment that followed was framed as heartbreak, as confusion, as betrayal even, and I listened without interruption, because hearing it allowed me to recognize how thoroughly my presence had been woven into their sense of stability. By the time the conversation ended, nothing had been resolved in the way families often hope for, through compromise or reassurance, but something had been made unmistakably clear, that whatever held us together had depended less on mutual care than on my willingness to remain accessible. As I returned to my room, the house felt smaller than it ever had before, not because of conflict, but because I could finally see the boundaries of the space I had been expected to fill, and how much of myself had been required to do so. I left early in the morning, not because I wanted to avoid anyone, but because departures carry their own weight when they are witnessed, and I needed mine to be clean, unobserved, free from the gravity of other people's reactions. The house was quiet in that deep, unguarded way it only ever was before dawn, when even familiar spaces seem unaware of themselves, and I moved through it slowly, touching nothing I did not need to, letting the silence remain intact. There was no final look back meant to preserve memory or extract meaning, only the practical awareness that this chapter had already ended long before I chose to close the door. What I carried with me was less than I arrived with years earlier, materially speaking, but far more precisely chosen, and as I settled into the life I had been building quietly in parallel, I understood how much energy I had once spent translating myself for people who had never fully listened. Distance clarified things quickly, not by softening them, but by placing them in proportion, allowing patterns to emerge without interruption. Phone calls from the family came at first with frequency and urgency, framed as concern, then as confusion, then as frustration when reassurance did not arrive in the form they expected, and eventually they slowed, spacing themselves out until they became occasional and carefully worded, as if each one were testing whether access still existed. It was during this time, as my days filled with new routines and responsibilities that belonged solely to me, that I allowed myself to revisit something I had known for years but had never let define me, the truth about how I came to be part of that family at all. I had learned it quietly, through paperwork that did not align, through conversations overheard rather than offered, through the slow accumulation of inconsistencies that eventually demanded acknowledgement, and when I confronted it privately, I chose not to confront them, deciding instead that biology mattered less than behavior, and that belonging, once given and received, did not need to be validated by blood. For a long time, that choice felt generous, even noble, a way of affirming love over origin, yet with distance I could finally see how asymmetrical that generosity had been, how my presence had been welcome not simply because I was cared for, but because I was useful, because my gratitude made me pliable, because my success could be counted on to flow back into the family structure rather than away from it. I was not raised to be independent, I was cultivated to be reliable, and that distinction, once visible, explained more than any argument ever could. The family, without my steady involvement, began to fracture along lines that had always existed but had been held together by my quiet interventions, missed payments escalating into more serious consequences, relationships strained by expectations no longer met, the celebrated child growing older under the weight of promises that could not be sustained. I learned these things indirectly, through mutual acquaintances, through fragments of conversation that reached me without seeking me out, and I felt no satisfaction in them, only a sober confirmation that systems built on unspoken dependency do not adapt easily when their foundation is removed. Years passed, not dramatically, but steadily, marked by progress that belonged to me alone, milestones reached without applause from the people who once claimed them as collective achievements. I built a life that was neither extravagant nor isolated, one grounded in clarity rather than obligation, where help was exchanged with consent and affection did not come with a ledger. In this life, I did not have to prove my worth by overextending myself, and the absence of that pressure felt, at times, like learning to breathe differently. The final message from the family arrived without accusation, stripped of urgency, acknowledging in its own careful way that things had changed beyond repair, that the distance between us was no longer a phase but a fact. I read it once, then again, and recognized in it not remorse, but acceptance, the quiet understanding that the role I had played could not be filled by anyone else and that its absence had reshaped their future in ways they would have to navigate without me. I did not reply, not out of cruelty, but because closure does not always require response, only recognition. Looking back now, I do not frame what I did as revenge in the way stories often demand, because there was no confrontation that resolved everything neatly, no moment where truth was weaponized for dramatic effect. What I took back was not money or status or acknowledgement, but access, the unquestioned availability that had defined my place in that family for so long. By withdrawing it completely and without spectacle, I forced a reckoning that could not be argued away or rewritten, because it unfolded slowly, in consequences rather than accusations. The year that began with ordinary mornings and familiar comforts ended with a certainty I had not known before, that love which requires self-erasure is not loyalty, and that sometimes the most lasting form of justice is simply stepping out of a story that was never written with your freedom in mind. I carry that understanding with me now, not as a wound, but as a boundary, clear and intact, marking the point where my life stopped being something others could rearrange and became, finally and fully, my own.